historical overview of Del Norte. There's all kinds of stuff out there, so you can go through and find stuff. But those are the two papers I'll be talking about tonight. Okay. Okay, so basically what happened is that when I got the request to make this talk, they said, you know, it was about beavers, so they put up a nice poster that says beavers in the Yolla Bolly Mountain. But mine is beavers in the Yolla Bolly Mountain. There's a big question mark about. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through how I have learned this. And I'm not going to tell you whether there's beaver there. I'm going to let you all at the end decide whether you think were ever beavers out there by giving you the data, the same data that I had, and then you can make up your mind whether you think there were beavers out there. So go ahead. So basically, the reason I put the last slide in is just to show in California, most people really, California history often doesn't start until 1849. But there was a heck of a lot going on in California that laid the groundwork for the miners and everyone else to come in. And so before 1825, much of the work was along the coast here. It was the Spanish were pretty much right with their missions were pretty much within a reasonable distance of the coast. And the big commercial thing was the getting of otters and things like that. The Russians would come down as far as the Russian River, and they used Aleut natives in their native kayak type things to harvest the beavers. Yeah, or I'm sorry, river otters or fur seals and sea otters. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is a ship's manifest in Canton, and it lists what they had. And you can see they had 74,000 seal skins. They had 200, and important, they didn't have many beavers, and this will come back. I want to always point this out, the beaver numbers, okay? They had 248 beavers, and then I just threw this one because I thought it was cool. They had one skunk. So I thought that was, yeah, I was kind of interested. Okay, the next one. And so the Russians were along the coast there as far as about Bodega Bay, and by 1812 the sea otters were getting hard to find because they'd taken most of them out. Okay, so during the Mexican Spanish period, the Russians were really prevented from going much farther south than the Russian River, but they did ask the Spanish, and then later it was in 1823 the Mexican government, for permission to hunt further south. So there was some hunting further south, but for the most part, they stayed north of the Bay Area. And by the late 1820s, they'd really basically trapped or captured, or however that you call it, all of the otter pretty much along the coast. Okay, there was really, and the seals, there was really, it wasn't commercially viable anymore to go in there. But this is when the beaver rush started. I call it so this is kind of a beaver mystery that I have here, where you could decide. The first thing that happens, there was a beaver rush from 1826 to 1844. And what had happened by 1826, they'd already trapped out most of the West, all the way out to Washington State, Idaho. It's hard to believe they could do all this back then, but in Utah. And so California was next on the list. And of course, beaver were, of all of the things, seals and everything else, beaver were apparently the most valuable. And especially, if I forget this later, I'll point it out now. The higher in altitude you are, the better the beaver furs, which kind of makes sense. So they were the most valuable ones, were the ones they were getting when they were going up the rivers up into the higher altitude. So this just shows you a couple dandies there sitting in London. You had to have a beaver hat or you weren't cool, or you weren't rich. I mean, normal people couldn't afford these. People even inherited them. Apparently they were worth a huge amount of money back then. So this was actually the first product, if you want to call it that, where Americans became millionaires out of them. And John J. Gabaster, you've probably heard of him, William Ashley, they both became millionaires due to the fur trade. Also from the north, you had Hudson's Bay people coming in. And they would travel yearly from Fort Vancouver down to California to trap beaver. Okay. And they stayed at French camp. So they would come down. Now this shows the Siskiyou Trail. Later I'll show you a different way they came so they could trap beaver most of the way. But generally speaking, if they were in a hurry, it has the traditional trail, almost what I-5 follows today. So that goes way back in time. And this little X over here, that's French camp. That's where they spent a lot of time during they overwintered there. And French camp is still there. It's right off the freeway somewhere. So, okay. So this map I just put in so you could give you an idea of some of the things we're talking about today. So I got the Central Valley, and what will be interesting, we'll get into, is this is where they trapped in that area, just to the east, all those rivers that are going up into the Sierra Nevada. They had some of the best beaver country, especially probably about 5,000–6,000 feet where it levels off and you get those big meadows and everything. So, okay. So we're going to narrow it down now and just kind of show how we get to where I become involved in trying to figure out what was going on, because the first person to come, the first actually American to go overland to California was Jedediah Smith in 1826. And when they got to California, he left a part of his, they called them brigades back then. So he left part of his brigade in California. He went over the Sierra, one of the first to cross over the Sierra, back to Utah, and then he returned in 1827 and 1828. And the whole time they were trapping beavers. And then Ewing Young, we're going to get closer now, because what's happening is we're going through time, and from 1829 to 1831, Ewing Young came through, and his guide was Kit Carson, and they traveled into Southern California, and then they headed north over the El Cajon, or the pass there, and down the Grapevine into the Central Valley, where they trapped beavers along the rivers that were coming out. And they would go up each river, however far you had to go to trap. And they made it about as far north as Siskiyou Pass. So it's the second expedition that we're going to look closely at. And that's because in 1832, they left again Santa Fe and took the Santa Fe Trail. And they arrived in LA in 1833 and then headed north to trap beavers. And this is where things got weird, okay? Because first of all, Karanko and Beard, most of you that like history know the book Genocide. I don't know if you know, but that book is no longer in print. The alley presses were destroyed. Virginia Miller sued their estate after they passed away. That book now sells on eBay for between $600 and $1,000. Or more, 12. I've seen 1,200. I was trying them out over, but yes, it's an excellent book, but I found a couple problems. It's like anything else that and so we'll get into what happened and how, you have to look at both the history and the biology. That's the thing you have to, you can't just have a biologist or a historian. So I'm looking at this, and they're talking about Young, that he made his way north along the seacoast and he tried to cross the mountains. Well, he was along the coast on the Mendocino coast, and what the Quest for Qualaloo says is quoted in Estelle Beard and Karanko's 1981 Genocide and Vendetta. And what they wrote in there is that the Ewing Young party followed the general northeast direction and passed through Long Valley to the mountains of the Eel River, and then he crossed the mountains to Round Valley. And that's what he said. And the reason I'm trying to figure this out is because did trappers make it? If trappers made it up into the Yolla Bolly, there's a good chance there were beavers up there. So I'm trying to think, the first thing I thought, well, they went through Round Valley, I should find out some information to get me up there to see if they were trapping beavers. So, and the Quest for Qualaloo, you've probably seen that, anybody that does much research around here. So it turns out, so I'm a little suspect by now. Something didn't ring right to me. They seemed too simple. So the first thing I did is I looked at Quest for Qualaloo, and it's by Oscar Luce. Well, it turns out the people that he's pointing out in here that gave the information that Ewing Young went through Round Valley, all a bunch of business people from Eureka. They have no idea about the history of Round Valley. One guy works, they were in the Society for Humboldt County Volunteers. One was a judge, one was a timber cruiser. So then I said, well, I got to go back further. I need to go back and look at the primary data. Where did all of this come from? Okay. So luckily for us, on the Ewing Young second trip to California, a man signed up with him, John Trumbull Warner, Juan Jose Warner. And the reason the second name is he founded Warner Ranch. It's west of Anza-Borrego State Park, way down south and north of Julian, if you know where the little town of Julian is. He has a really good ranch there, so he converted to Catholicism and got there. But he was on the trip on Ewing Young's second trip. And he wrote a thing, Reminiscences from 1831 to 1846. And the first thing he notes is they ran into the Hudson's Bay Company people in the Central Valley. And one of the reasons that LaFramboise and Work were traveling together, and they like to be close by, was the Indians were starting to get hostile because they were dying because of the typhoid and the disease that the trappers brought in. So they were sticking together. So they'd been there since early 32, okay? And then, so it turns out that he wrote a memoir of this. So now I said, well, great, I can go out, I can compare what he's got with what Frankel and Beard said and these other people. They should tell me whether he went through Round Valley. So the entire description of their travel from Clear Lake in Northern California to the Umpqua River is only 2 sentences, so it's pretty brief. He didn't keep it in detailed diary, but the important thing is here, he crossed over to Clear Lake and he hit the coast. He probably went over somewhere near where Fort Bragg from about where Willits is, where his final cross over to the coast was. And all it says for this, which certainly doesn't say him going through Round Valley, is Young followed along up the coast searching with little success for rivers having beaver. Keep in mind, every time I say they don't find beaver, put that in here and keep adding those up, okay? So he said he didn't find beaver. So in a fruitless attempts to recross the mountain range, he succeeded in getting over the mountains and fell upon the coast range. So he did not go through Round Valley. He continued north. And what I did is I tried to lay out what they said and what I said. And as you can see, the black line on the map goes up where we definitely know he went is up to about where the yellow line is. And the people that wrote the biography of him have him going in the yellow line right up the coast. And you'll see why later that's impossible. But for right now, we'll just say that that's where they propose. And when I looked at it, based on what we'll talk about in a while, I saw them cut inland. Where did they cut inland? Right where one goes into Leggett from the Pacific Coast Highway from the ocean. Because if anybody knows the land north of there, you ain't going to get there to Bear Harbor walking with a horse. So they have him actually heading back south and hitting the north end of Round Valley before he heads back north up the trail to Oregon. So the next slide. So basically, John Work, who we're going to talk about in a minute, kept the journal. He was with the Hudson's Bay Brigade. When they crossed over, they found evidence of Ewing Young's camp. So we know pretty much where they went through there because there was the diary of John Work tells us that. And there were 2 biographers of Ewing Young, okay? And neither of them even hinted that they passed through Round Valley. There's just no evidence that they passed through Round Valley. The first Ewing Young has been reached the coast 75 miles north of the Russian establishment of Fort Ross, moved north for the 42nd parallel. That's definitely didn't go through Round Valley. Okay, the next one. They had little success in finding beavers again. Okay, and then on the other one, March 1833, they went up the Pacific coast about 75 miles and then continued as far as the Umpqua River. So it's pretty brief. But what is clear is they didn't go through Round Valley. Okay. So the next thing I looked at, to me, I felt that was pretty certain they didn't go through there. There was no reason in the way all the diary, what little was there and what little I know, they didn't go through there. It was probably not likely. So then there was a second one. So now we know that Ewing Young didn't pass through the, now we got the Hudson's Bay Brigade. Did they pass through Round Valley? Because, okay, go ahead. And so this is why it's important to go back to primary data. If you look, this is a misquote what happened. This is Overland Monthly. This is a magazine, comes out of San Francisco. And I'm familiar with Tassin. Tassin, he wrote an article in here, but Tassin was from France. He came over and he fought for the Union in the Civil War, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then he headed west and he was doing little write-ups in magazines and stuff on the Indians as he was going along. And he's usually pretty accurate. I've been using his stuff a lot over in Round Valley because that's where some of my research is doing. But this is the important part, and I'm not going to get into all the detail here, but if you look at the original account of Tassin, it says they are nearly unanimous on the subject about 100 years since, which have been 1787. So a body of some 600 white men having women and children with them appeared on the coast. One of them passed through Round Valley. So yes, but and then you go to Taranko, Beard, who are quoting the primary data, and they are nearly unanimous on the subject about 100 white men having women and children appeared on the coast. Well, there's a big difference between maybe 30 or 40 years ago, 100 men and 600 people crossing through there. So you can't have 600 people floating around without some history. Okay, it didn't happen. It was one of his informants explained this to him, and something could have happened, but it certainly didn't have anything to do with 100 people or 600 people going through. So by this time, I was really getting leery of what was going on. So, and this is just a voyageur. It's not one from the group, but this is the John Work and Michel Leframbois Brigade of 1832 to 1833. And it just turns out, and this is where, again, primary documents, John Work's diary was published by Alice Maloney in 1943. It's called Fur Brigade to the Ventura, John Work's California Expedition. And since its publication, nobody ever went back and questioned her. They just assumed that whatever she said in here was the gospel truth. And so in the future, including Taranko and Beard, they just went back and quoted her and what she did. And this is where it gets a little hairy. You'll see it gets real in a lot of detail. But basically what happened was, this is now on the internet, so it's easy to get a hold of. When I looked at this 20 years ago, whenever I did this, it wasn't, I found it at the Fresno Library down here where I live. So I drove about 80 miles up to the Fresno Library, and some nice lady there gave me a whole copy of this thing. So I took it home. Okay. And basically what we're going to look at is they spent the winter of 1833 up near Sutter Buttes. And they circled down along the Bay Area, past Fort Ross, and they went up. And then when they got up there to that point where 101 cuts inland, you'll see Maloney has them going way up and coming way back down, and I have them cutting across, and that's where they split, we'll talk about. And Work headed south and Leframbois north, but Round Valley is not there. Okay, and the other thing that they used as evidence was that they found Hudson's Bay trader beads there. Well, you can find trade beads 100, 200 miles. That's what they use as a trade item. So that's no information at all for understanding that. Okay. So, and this is a little bit of close up. Again, they first headed, and now the diary is helpful. So I watch it, and they're heading down. They came down along the north side of the San Francisco Bay, passed by Vallejo's place, over past Laguna Santa Rosa, where they did see some beavers. And if you don't know, Laguna Santa Rosa is just to the west, east of Sebastopol, going Santa Rosa. There's a place out there with some holds water sometimes. So, and that again, they worked their way to the Russian River, and he wrote and said on his journal on April 28th, although they spent a considerable amount of energy exploring up some of the rivers draining into the Pacific, they encountered no sign of beavers. Okay. So what I did is I finally said, well, I'm going to follow this diary with a map. Now, there'll be more detail. This is just to kind of give you an idea. So I took all of this, these are 15-minute maps, feathered them all together, connected them into one big data, and I took them out to Design CAD. And I went into Design CAD and I put in all of that other information. Okay. So now we'll get down to the specific things. So this is where things went haywire. On May 3rd, he writes in his journal, they crossed the 10-mile river. We camped a little way from the river on account of the bad weather to wait for people behind and mark. And then it says marked 6 miles, and this is where she messed up. So what she read is they crossed the river and then they marked 6 miles. So she's got them on May 3rd, all the way up there at Westport. Okay. But they in reality had just crossed and they were sitting down here at the 10-mile river on May 3rd to May 3rd. Okay, so already there's 6 miles ahead of them in the diary. Okay. The next day, Maloney, May 3rd, she has him going all the way up to Rockport on May 4th. Meanwhile, he's just getting to Westport where she was on May 4th. So they're a day behind. Okay, and then it gets even worse because when he goes north, and this will make sense that he have driven that coast highway. They head off on May 4th and they stop at Hardy Creek, which is just about where one goes inland. Okay. And that day she's still May 4th is way up at Rockwell. By now she's way up almost to Shelter Cove. So, she's way ahead of, and if you notice at Hardy Creek, they spent 4 nights there. Okay, and this is where it really becomes obvious that she was wrong because she never came down there and even looked at the place. Okay, so except for one deep gully and 2 steep hills, we had roads to pass that were very good, and that's on their trip on the May 5th when they were going up to spend the next 4 days at Hardy Creek. Okay, and there you go. There's the road that was easy to pass. It was very easy to tell where they were because anybody that knows north of Fort Bragg, before you get there, there's that nice big open spot. And where it says it lay through a fine plain of rich land extending 500 to 600 yards from the shore at the foot of hills to whose sloping sides next to the sea are without wood and covered with fine grass. So that pretty much iced it for me that I had the right day because that's the only place you can find anything like that all the way to the Russian River. Okay. So I have them in Westport, as I showed you before, May 3rd, May 5th, but they were all the way up here. And she was, by the time they got there the 5th, she's off the map. She's almost to Shelter Cove. So now we're going to look why they had to turn inland. So they spent the night of May 5th there. And work estimated they traveled 10 miles that day. They seem to always overestimate that, which I guess I would if I was working that hard. So they went about 6 miles. They thought they traveled about 10 miles. Okay. So what happened is when you get up to Wong Creek, and you can see that's where one turns inland, that's where they camped. It's somewhere probably near Wong Creek, that more than Hardy Creek. Yeah. So on May 6th, because it was so it was so bad up there, LaFramboise and 3 men went up the coast to see if they could get through. So they stayed in camp that day. Okay. By then, she's got them up almost in the mouth of the Mattole River. Okay. And they're still sitting down there trying to figure out how to get through this place. So Monsieur LaFramboise and 3 men, I guess it's Michael LaFramboise, Michel LaFramboise, and 3 men went on north along the coast and represent the road as exceedingly bad. Indeed, so much so that it is doubtful whether we'll be able to pass our party. Okay, so he goes back and he talks to work, and he goes, okay, well, let's try one more time. So this is where they're camped on the highway. So the next day, LaFramboise and his men went up all the way to about, I would guess, Usal Creek. And the reason I think that's a good camping spot, and once, as bad as it is to get there, if you go inland a little bit and go via Rockport, you can kind of sneak up there pretty easy that far. But once you get to Usal, you just really can't go north. It's not practical. So some of the people were out hunting behind the mountains to the east and represent the country, had a pretty good appearance, thinly timbered with oak and pine. So, that's how you could tell where you're at in the old days. You climbed a big hill. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. So what happened is that while Laframboise was gone, they came up with, well, if he comes back and it's not good to go that way, we're going to go inland. Okay, so word recorded that despite good weather, they did not raise camp that day. Instead, Laframboise led 4 men along the coast, making a second effort to find their way north. Okay, and this is where one turns inland, and it's just there's no way. So Monsieur Laframboise and 3 men went on north along the coast and represent the roads exceedingly bad, and indeed so much so that it's doubtful that whether we'll be able to pass our party. Okay. So, and I put in a USGS map so you could see this. This is not a place where you'd want to go, let alone take horses or anything. So they camped there Framboise camped there on the 7th and found they couldn't go any further. So he turned around, and on May 8th, they spent the last night. They spent May 8th there. And this so all this is going on, and that's May 7th. Maloney's got them all the way up there at May 4th. So by May 7th, she's all the way up almost to the Etola River. Okay. So she thought they went through all that in one day, that countryside. Okay. Now, this is the view south from, if any of you ever been out to Needle Rock, the Needle Rock Ranch. And that's a view south along the coast, and just over that little kind of road you see, it drops down behind that one little knoll there. That's Bear Harbor. So I just wanted to show again what a challenge it is to try to go through that country. It's pretty impossible. So at that point, they turned inland and headed northeast. And that's where I believe Ewing Young turned inland, because you just can't go any farther north. So to me, it was pretty logical. And if you know the Eel River, when he got over the Eel River, he just went right up to the mouth of the Eel River. You can take the whole, pretty much the eel from there, even though it's redwood country, because it's got a wide enough, river bed down there. So, okay. Next one. So what I did is I talked to a surveyor that worked for Louisiana Pacific, and he said if I were going towards the Eel River, I'd go up Hardy Creek, Wan Creek Ridge to Huckleberry Pass, then down Walden Creek to Hollow Tree Creek, and he was a surveyor for LP. And he said we have determined to cut across the mountain and pass along behind them where we expect deep ravines will not be so frequent. So this is where they turned inland. And so it's 12 air miles from their camp there to, and I have a big circle. That's roughly the area where they would have hit the river. And so he made the following entry: blowing fresh part of the day, fine weather. We raised camp, ascended a steep mountain. We encamped on a small spot on the brow of the hill, pretty clear of woods with barely enough water for the horses. Well, if you're down in that country, the only place that could be is up on a ridge. And that's why they were probably definitely taking the higher ridges. You don't want to be down in those redwoods. And that's why there was a little problem with the water. Okay. So they encamped on the 9th there. And then the next day, they hit the river. And this fits perfect with the description. Fine weather. We continued 9 miles northeast. Obviously, it wasn't that far, but it felt like that, I'm sure. The road was very rugged, places difficult. The river where we are encamped appears remarkably well adapted for beaver, yet there's not the least appearance any beaver have ever been in it. Okay, that's why there's, it's good for everybody to take a look at the history, because it may not be as clear as it seems sometimes. Okay. So then from South Leggett, they were probably camped just about where Rattlesnake Creek comes into, that goes along and meets the South Fork of the Eel after it goes behind Branscombe. So they headed up to their next encampment, which was about 7.8 air miles, and they spent 2 days there. Okay. And the reason they spent 2 days there is they were getting ready to split. Laframboise was going back to Fort Vancouver, and Wirt was going back to spend another winter in California trapping beaver. And so I put an X here. This is where their camp was. And I'm pretty sure that they were at the headwaters of the east branch of the South Fork of the Eel River. Because if you see this that road there, that ridge, that's Bell Springs Road.
Headwaters of the
and
east
Bell Springs
branch.
Road is the only way you can stay high on a ridge and get through that countryside. And it was actually the original road into Eureka. 101 wasn't there going through the redwoods. That was the first road to Eureka. It went up past Harris, dropped down to Alder Point, and went through Blacksburg, and it came all the way in to avoid all those redwoods. That was built in about the 1870s by Chinese labor, so I've been told. Okay, so I have them.
Me earlier, and I didn't believe her, but you would know.
There's called East, North, South. I mean, they got more forks of the Eel River, right? So this is Benbow. If you know where Benbow US 101 crosses, right there at Benbow, that's the East Fork that comes in. So, and there's Round Valley way the heck down here again. So by now, I'm not only I'm sure that they never went to Round Valley. It's pretty clear when you go back to the primary data. The Framboise, okay, so the next slide. Okay, so this is again from Works Journal. Michelle and party came on a piece of the same road and will have to take to the east or northeast and cross on a mountain which there is some snow. Beyond this mountain, it is expected he will fall upon Smith's Road and better country. Michelle's party amounts to 30 men, 17 whites and 13 Indians, and my party amounts to 33 men, 27 whites and 6 Indians. Again, nowhere close to what, 600 people that they thought were wandering through there. And I took this picture from Bell Springs Road, and this is North Yolla Bolly Peak. So when they say that road, that's the Bell Springs Road was obviously an Indian trail for centuries. And so when they said road back then, it's not what we call a road. To them, they weren't going up and down like that through, vegetation that was a road to them, So this is a view just to give you an idea when he talked about snow-capped mountains. Okay, the next slide. And I also took a picture, just in case, again, from Bell Springs Road, and Kitty knows all this area like the back of her hand. There's South Yolla Bolly Mountain, and there's North Yolla Bolly Mountain. And then Black Rock Mountain's the highest point there, far on the left. So when they hit that ridge, that's what they were looking at. They weren't going to go south to Round Valley. So there's no way La Framboise went through Round Valley. Okay. So I have them going up and cutting inland, and that's where they split on May 12th. The Framboise continued on, and at the Central Valley, he took the Siskiyou Trail. The reason I show that other dot, that's how they came in. They came down through this other way and came out in the valley at Cow Creek, because obviously he could trap for beaver the whole way. So they came in originally, but he returned. The Framboise was in a hurry to get back to Fort Vancouver, so he went that way, and Wirt clearly went this way because he's still keeping a diary. So I just didn't bring it all up here. But you can see he went back south and returned towards French Camp. So he went way west of Round Valley. So it's clear, and it kind of ruined any theory I had that these guys were trapping beavers up in the Yolla Bolly because they never got near the Yolla Bolly. Okay.
What's with the 50,000 people?
Oh, you want to back it up. When he returned the next year to Fort Vancouver, he only had 1,023 beaver skins. Now, one of the reasons they weren't getting a lot is this was also an economic political thing, believe it or not. Beavers were political. What happened was the British didn't want the Americans coming into the Western California. So one of their goals from Hudson's Bay was to go down there and trap out all the beavers, so the Americans would have no reason to come in because there were no beavers to trap. So that was really their goal. And so they didn't get many, but it said that led to the death of 50,000 people. That's because as they passed down through the Central Valley, they were given typhoid disease. It took out 50,000 people. Now, we didn't have those kind of problems up here for whatever reason. I'm writing a whole paper on the genocide that occurred here, but it's not real. Some of the locals here whose people date back to them would like to think it's disease, but up here it's not disease. It's straightforward genocidal actions against the people. So, but this just kind of shows you again where Maloney went and how he returned up through there to Fort, and Wirt returned again far to the west of Round Valley, come back down into the Central Valley. Okay. So in 20 years, they'd converted much of the slope of the Pacific into a fur wasteland. And so with the furs gone, Hudson's Bay had no reason to continue, so they just abandoned California. And by 1848, by the time California became, the gold rush of 1849, they were already well long gone from the area. They never came back because they trapped out basically all the beavers. So the records suggest that maybe 20,000 beaver were taken by Hudson's Bay, and maybe 40,000 total beavers were taken, pelts were taken here. And there was about 35,000 in the Snake River country. So it was a very rich as far as beaver. There were a lot of beaver here to be able to do that. And this just shows you fur trappers inadvertently spread malarial, intermittent fever. Mortality rates were 50 to 90%. There were people that said you could go through villages and there wasn't a person alive. Everyone in the village had died of this disease. And so in some cases, entire tribes of people were wiped out. And what it did, so when the gold miners came in, the reason there was no violence with Indians because the Indians had all died of disease. So when those trappers came in, who were a lot of times just greenhorns from the east, hardly even knew how to use a gun, they didn't need to know because there were no Indians there to even get in their way. They had been pretty much, had died of this fever. So the red race in the heart of California was so crippled it could offer but little shadow of opposition to the gold mining flood that swept over in 1849. And that Shelburne Cook's an anthropologist who was doing population studies. So the environmental effects of this were that I'm sure that beavers are a keystone species. So when you're up in those higher country of the Sierra, they would have been they were one of the most efficient ways to keep a place healthy as far as ecologically with water and all of that. And the presence of beavers may be up to 80 times more efficient than large woody debris in promoting salmon reproductive success. Okay. So that's the end of part one, and we'll go to part two. So what I did is, so I kind of worked through all this and I go, okay, well, they didn't go up there to trap beavers. So now I got to look at beavers themselves. I have to look at the biology and what else I can find in historic records with beavers, because I'm getting none of that from so far. I'm striking out on whether there were beavers in the Yolla Bolly.
Sorry, give me 1 second. For some reason, it locked out for me. Give it a minute. Oh, there we go. He was thinking. Everybody in the Zoom, can you see that?
So this is my second try, and I just again put all this up because a lot of people miss it. So okay, you can go through this one and this one because I've talked about it a little bit, but that's so this to the next slide. This is the book I wrote. Some of you may have a copy. It's out on my internet site. It was published by the Forest Service in 1995. And how I fell into beavers was doing this book, and because I hiked a lot in the Yolla Bolly. So you can go to the next slide. It's how I got the beavers from way over here. And there's North Yolla Bolly and there's Shell Mountain. We're going to talk about them. And my study area, which is well defined because I'm doing quantitative analysis with it. So that's my study area. And you can see it's not too far from Shell Mountain. It's in this big circle around there just to the right of it. That's the headwaters of the Mad River. So to the south, you get the middle fork of the Eel, to the north is Mad River, okay? And so what I'm trying to do, and what I've been trying to do for a few decades, is take all of this stuff to describe the environment. Climatic history, paleoecology, terrestrial fauna, fire history, natural disturbances, geologic forces, all of the stuff that can impinge or affect how that environment looks, okay? And so if you look at the environment is passing through time. It's trying to get to a homeostasis state, that is a steady state where everything is not too hot, not too cold, everything is just right. And it probably never gets to that in very few times because you have climate, natural erosion, fire, you have all these things, natural things impinging on the environment. And on top of that, then you have land use activities, which are driven by socioeconomic factors. So all of this stuff is what can affects the environment through time. So I went out there and I had worked in Orleans where, you know, the trees were this big, you know, the Douglas fir they were cutting. So I'm going down there and they're sending me out to look at these timber sales. I go, what are these little bitty trees doing out here? You know, I'm expecting to see these great big trees, not being from there. And what happened is they ran out of timber up there. They're overcutting so much that they had to go down the Mad River and start cutting because to reach the volumes that Congress made them take, or they would get in trouble. That's what happened. They went down and they started taking out trees like this. And of course, from an ecological standpoint, imagine how many trees this size it takes to cut to get those big Doug firs. So they had more roads, more culverts, more clear cuts, all this kind of stuff going on because you don't have a good environment for trees. What you've got instead, these dead oaks, because these trees are growing up in oak woodlands and they're overtopping the oaks and they're killing the oaks. And it's lack of anthropogenic burning since the 1850s that did that. Okay, next slide. And I proved that because luckily when you work for the Forest Service, you work with all these great specialists. So I'm always draining everybody's brain for what, you know, what, if I have a question about something. Well, I looked at the timber silvicultural data for 3 different timber sales, yellow jacket, lousy timber sale, and I think the raglan timber sale. 1,543 trees were cored. And you can see, and this would have been in 1985 age, you can see about 100, 110 years ago, that's where they started. And when you go way back in time, 200-year-old trees, there's hardly any. Okay, so most of the trees came in the last 120 years as of 1985. Now it's a little bit longer, but it gives you an idea something's going on that all these trees all of a sudden came in. Okay. And this will, I have papers out there on it. You can go in there, my book, and one called Growing the Forest Backwards. Just real briefly, I did GIS before there was GIS. Okay, I carried around a 7.5-minute map in the field with a Mylar over it with these polygons that had a number on it, and I would take each of those polygons, which had been done from an airplane, but with timber type. So if there was a Douglas fir forest there, it would have it. So I took those and put them into a Lotus 123 spreadsheet, which was pre-Excel spreadsheet. And I came up with some figures. So you can take a look here. The brushlands and grasslands stayed pretty much the same because of the soil type. But if you look, 36% of the area was oak woodlands. By 1985, 6% of that was oak, and 47% now of the area was Douglas fir. So it was a total switch because of the lack of fire. Okay, the next one. So I worked quite a while to put this together. I took my data for 20,000 acres, and the first ecosystems typing specialist did on our forest was the North Fork of the Eel, my luck. So I took my data, and it's a long story, but you know how you do, it was taking all of this together and then moving my data across to his by matching up the similar timber types and everything. And what we did is we came up with a map. So this map here is geo-referenced. This is how it looked out there in 1865. And you can see, take a look at how much of that is orange on that map, okay? Okay, go ahead and the next one. That's 1985. Now, and just as a brief aside here, again, how all this stuff comes together, okay, about 1940, Neil Rahm is the district ranger at Mad River, and he can't figure out why all the deer are disappearing. So he goes out and he looks and he says, well, maybe it's disease, because they were catching, some of the settlers were killing 300 deer a year themselves. There were 80, 100,000 deer taken out of this place. I have all the figures out on my thing. But what happened was, if it looks like this, there's no deer habitat. So the reason the deer disappeared wasn't because of disease or anything else. It was because they ran out of places to go find food. And so there has been a huge decrease in the deer population. And then I put this as kind of an heuristic map. I took the figures that I had from 1854 and 1985, and we'll talk a little bit in a second about pollen analysis. And what I did is I tried to take some pollen analysis stuff that we'll talk about and just kind of try to get an idea. So don't view this as literal, but it's a pretty good how the whole place trended during over 8,500 years during the xerothermic period, which we have a lot of pollen data for those. I'll talk a little bit about the pollen data. Okay, so now we're getting into, were there beavers in the Yolla Bolly? It took me all the way to get to there. So I'm hiking in the Yolla Bolly in the early 1980s, and I come up on some aspen trees. You can go to the next slide. Okay, just so everybody knows, if you don't, where the Yolla Bolly is, it's centered right along the divide between the Sacramento and the Pacific coast, and it's right down at the extreme southern part of Trinity County and a little bit into Tehama County. And this is from West Low Gap. I was out there only a few years ago with one of my friends over there. And she actually made it to the site. I hurt my knee that day, and I only made it in about 3 or 4 miles or something. And it turns out, anyway, I messed up my knee. But this is North Yolla Bolly Peak up here, and that's Black Rock Mountain there. And the trail goes along the base of that. Okay. And this is just a close-up. And this is Cedar Basin in here. When you're looking, we'll talk about a little bit in a couple of minutes. Okay, the next one. Okay, and that's Black Rock Lookout. You can do the next one now. And Black Rock Lookout, this is a look close up. It was abandoned years ago. I'm amazed it's still standing. I've been up there before a couple of times. It's a great view, but I wouldn't climb up in it. It's even 20 years ago, I wouldn't have felt safe climbing up in that thing. It was about ready. I'm surprised it's still there, that it hasn't fallen over. Okay. And in the distance, I'm trying to give you a context of where all this is. So in the distance to the south, you can see South Yolla Bolly Peak over the snow on the left, upper left. Next slide. And Mount Lynn is called. It's South Yolla Bolly Peak there on the left. And there's the next slide. And then to the west, from there, you can see Kings Peak, Pratt Mountain, and Red Mountain. So you're looking, and you can see all the stuff that's happened with fire in there. This was the 2000 August complex fire that went through there. Okay. And then to the north, and I put that in because I thought it was a cool name, Dead Puppy Ridge there. But actually, I use it a lot. If you go out Penny Ridge, you can hit this ridge here, and you can go right up the arrow and up the back side of the timber on top, and then you're over to Shell Mountain. So that's the way you can get to Shell Mountain. One of the ways you can get to Shell Mountain. And there's also a ridge out there called Schoolmarm Ridge. So I don't know where they got these names, but I thought they were pretty cool. So, okay, the next slide. So a little just on climate history, got a whole paper out there on paleoclimate and the climate of this area of the North Fork. And in that, it's more of a generalized thing because it's too small of an area. I was looking at the general specific area of southern Humboldt, northern Mendocino. So we have, this is Humboldt 558. This was an archaeological site up on Pilot Ridge. I don't know if you know where Pilot Ridge is, but it's pretty much due east of here. If you go up to Berry Summit and you make a left on that paved road towards what they call the ski area, if you continue, you can take a paved road all the way down to Mad River. We'll come out at 36. It's a really nice drive if you ever want to do. And we found over 100 archaeological sites on Pilot Ridge. And we had major excavations for 3 years. And during one of the excavations, we had Jim West, we'll talk about a little bit later. Jim West came in and he got a pollen core out of here. Okay, the next one. And so what I did is I looked at trying to reconstruct what was the weather up there for this vegetation to have these aspen trees growing. So I looked at the pollen analysis data, and this wasn't by West, but pollen data core was taken from Clear Lake that goes back 130,000 years. And so the full glacial record indicates a virtual absence of oaks from the basin. Under colder conditions, pines were dominant with sagebrush, species of cedar and juniper more abundant than the present. With post-glacial warming, oak reestablishment commenced only about 13,000 years ago. Perfect timing with the beginning of the Holocene. So again, okay, the next slide. So this is one of the pollen cores from 558. And you can see through time, the Doug fir after about 2,600 BP before present, they started to increase and started having a decrease in the oak. So already, and Lucy Thompson up here, who's a Yurok, there's a quote in her paper that says that when we came into this is paraphrasing, when we came into this country, it was very open, and despite all of our burning, there are more conifers today than when we moved here. And that's because of that trend here. Okay. And also, there were two other cores that are important that are in my paper. I tried to do a little abbreviation because basically these are within a few miles of the up high Yolla Bolly country. They're down on the Mendocino Forest up near Indian Dick Ranger Station, if you know where that is. And these two, A&M Lake and Lily Pond West, also took core samples there, and they also came out with the same changes in vegetation towards the conifers coming back in now. So this is the pollen and climatic data for the Coast Ranges has been presented in a generalized model now. And this is the glacial cirque lake on North Yolla Bolly. And there were quite a few glaciers. I was really surprised. Some of the glaciers came down as low as 4,000 feet or something up there. It's all in my paper on climate. It's out on my website. But there was quite a bit of glaciation out there. This is South Yolla Bolly, Mount Lynn at 8,000 foot. I've camped in here before, and this is Square Lake. And so some of the evidence of the Pleistocene is simply the glacial cirques. That's the first giveaway, okay? And of course, the second one was beaver habitat, was aspen trees. That's the first thing that when I started this whole thing, asking that question. But it turns out they're not the only tree up there. We have aspen trees and several other species I'll get into. They're only found further north of the Siskiyous. The Klamaths are all the way over in the Sierra. So it's probably 80 or 90 air miles at least to the closest aspen trees to these. They're a remnant disjunct population from the Pleistocene, still surviving up there in the Yolla Bolly. Okay. And this is the stand in 1981, and the trail from Mad River started at Three Forks, went up over South Fork Mountain near Kelsey Peak, dropped down across the South Fork, and then up across the face of that Cedar Basin of North Yolla Bolly, and it went over that ridge and then dropped down into the Sacramento Valley. Okay. And there's a good map where you can see it. The Humboldt Trail is right there. It was laid in that Humboldt Trail was original. Of course, it was an Indian trail, I'm sure, but it was established. The first use may have been by Joe Russ, which some of you maybe know the name of Joe Russ. Some of those people brought cattle in, and they used this trail to drive them in. I don't have that well documented, but I have somebody that really knows trails told me that. The first evidence I have of it was in 1855 in the spring when Pierce Asbell led 8 pack mules with deer hides over that trail to the Central Valley to sell them at Kingsley's Trading Post. But you can see one of the ridges is called Fisher Ridge again. You know, that's a real boreal type animal. And luckily, another woman with us on the trip took some pictures this last year. So there's still aspen. They survived the fire out there, which was good. I was worried about that. So the aspen, okay, the next one did survive the fire. And then another tree up there is the foxtail pine. And that's what I say, there's more than just one tree that's a remnant population. And this is on the top of the hill. And I hiked in one day to the aspen trees. I was alone. I had my backpack and I just hiked up the hill, which I don't think I'll be doing anymore, probably a couple thousand feet. And I camped up in the saddle one night. And I didn't even know at the time, this is a new, you know, I didn't know there were going to be foxtail pine. And then the picture on, and how isolated these are, the picture on the left, when I lived in Three Rivers, which is near the entrance to Sequoia National Park, I took a hike one day. These are 11,300 feet, foxtail pine. And another place I know where they're at is over at the Whitney Portal, where the trail goes up to Mount Whitney. There's another trail there that goes off to a lake, and I found foxtail pines around there. So they're limited distribution. I'm sure there's some up in the Klamath. And I have a name. If you're really interested in the distribution of trees, if you want a handy dandy book, you can Google it, and it's called Griffin and Critchfield are the authors. If you enter that, and then you enter the distribution of forest trees in California. They worked for the Forest Service. And then it's an excellent because it categories each tree, then has a little map by county to show you where the trees are. So it's really useful if you're trying to figure where trees are. And they show these types of things. But for the aspen trees, they only have them in one place. CalFlora and everybody only knows them over on Soldier Ridge, which is up near Indian Dick Ranger Station. I found them spread through there. In fact, this will come up in a second. Okay, next. And so this is the saddle there. That's looking to the east of Yolla Bolly, and you can see Mount Lynn over there to the right. And then way in the distance, you can see the Sierra Nevada. So that's where you found, up in the gnarliest spot, that's where you found the foxtail pine. Okay. And then, and this is, so I'm going to go sideways a bit again to show you how history and environment all come together. So I'm red carded in 1987. There's a fire, Travis fire, and I'm out there working on the fire doing cultural resource, trying to protect stuff. And we get news coming in that a cat driver had hit a grave. There's a gravestone out there in the middle of nowhere, okay? And I knew all about it. We all knew about it. I didn't know exactly where it was. So my assignment, another guy's assignment, was to go out there and see if we could protect it or what was going on. And if you look in the background, you see that cat trail? That cat trail is going down that original road from Covelo to Weaverville. So it was right on the Covelo-Weaverville trail that they laid the fire line. And next to it was growing a western juniper. And why it grew, I was stunned. You know, I took a picture of it because I couldn't believe this western juniper is totally out of any context. But I would have never even known that had I not already been doing my studies. But it again confirms to me that they're growing out there. And right, this was obviously as young and came in, maybe a bird dropped something there or something. But again, this is, so you can go to the next slide. So I follow it just past there a ways, maybe a few hundred yards. The trail goes through these woods. If you see this flagging over there, that's where the grave site is. And this is a trail. And keep in mind, look at that vegetation. See how dense it is in there? Okay, go to the next slide. There's his grave. And there's his mother, actually, when she passed away, paid enough money to have them go out there and put this gravestone in out in the middle of nowhere on the Travis Ranch. Before that, the Travis Ranch people had put up a picket fence around it in the 40s, but I got a picture of the picket fence collapsed already. So when I got there, the only thing left was this grave site. Okay, and this is Littlefield upper left there. And the reason I left this other picture in there is, look at that rope. That's how they got him. They hung him when they killed him. And so next picture. So this is actually from the 1895, October 1895 investigation of the murder of Jack Littlefield. And what happened was that he was the 19th person killed out in this area by George White. I mean, this is like the J.R. Ewing on steroids, okay? So this is just a little, you know, cut into that just to show you what was going on out there. But again, how it all links back. Because if you look at those pictures, there's almost no undergrowth in those pictures, okay? And this is Sid Wilburn, Jim Wilburn. Jim Wilburn is the son of Grizzly Jim Wilburn, who settled in Henshaw Valley in 1855. And this is the sheriff of Trinity County, Tom Bergen. And he's, and they drove all the way, they rode all the way down from Weaverville to do this, because this, once you go over the hill, most of the stuff to the west of South Fork Mountain, it's called Over the Hill in southern Trinity County. Their business is all with Round Valley. It's just too far to go to Weaverville. So other than for county stuff. So this was, and then go ahead. This was an investigation, and this is Bergen again, and this is the DA. And this, it's kind of washed out, but that's actually the trail right there. Okay, and that's Antone Ridge. You're looking south, and that's Antone Ridge. So this is where he was stopped. And then later he was, if you want to go back to that last slide, I can mention. Okay, so on this slide, the reason those people are in those positions, okay, he's where Littlefield was shot and killed. Jim Wilburn is standing next to the tree that they hung him on. Why they'd hang you after they shot you, I don't know. I'm just reporting, okay? And the tree has collapsed since then. And then Tom Bergen's where they buried the body. So that's why those guys are in those positions. So you can go to the next one again now. So now they're up there, just, this would only be east of there, maybe 200, 300 yards, where it goes into an open glade, okay? So that was kind of my aside into, and there's another juniper, because now I'm going back to, looking at junipers, but that was kind of an aside of how they never know where you're going to find something. Just keep your eyes open. This is up near Shell Mountain. You can see again, Kings Peak, Pratt Mountain, Chemise Mountain in the distance. And most of these these juniper grow in this kind of serpentine soil or kind of a soil. You can see there, they're growing in, that's mostly a serpentine soil. And I just included this picture because I thought it was a nice shot of from over in Mad River looking up to Shell Mountain, and this ridge here also leads up to there, and that has the biggest, before the fire, who knows that had the biggest ponderosa I've ever seen in the North Coast Plain. There was some huge some of the biggest ones you see in the Sierra Nevada on this ridge. And you can get to that ridge easy if you know the Jones Ridge Road that goes around the headwaters of the Mad River, and to its right would be the Mendocino, right at the divide, and then to the left is Six Rivers. So you can get up there pretty easy. You could get up there in a day. Okay. So we're going to go back now. Look at Works Journal again, or Michelle. They came on a piece of the same road, and we'll have to go to the east, which there's some snow. And beyond this mountain, it is expected it will fall upon Smith's Road, Jedediah Smith's Road, in better country. And this is where Jedediah Smith, who went before them, went through there. And he ended up going through Hay Fork, over to High and Palm, and then up near Willow Creek, and maybe just to the east of Hoopa, but up in that area. And then they finally hit the coast. And so when he was going up the hill, the road that goes up the hill now towards, it's not 36, but it's another county road that drops down into Redding. You're looking due north into the North Yolla Bollies. And what that really led me to think is that if I'm a trapper and I know that beaver's fur is more valuable the higher in altitude, to me, although it's not confirmed, I think it's probably highly likely they at least visited that area, but I don't know it for certain. So the thing whether trappers were ever there, I don't know. Next slide. So a little bit of beaver biology. This picture, it's a nice beaver lodge, but it's in near Bay of Fundy National Park in New Brunswick, so it's a little ways from here. But I thought I took it, but it's a good picture of a beaver lodge, so that's what I was after. Okay, so there are 3 types of subspecies of beaver in California, and as it says in this thing here, they were basically by 1860, thanks to the trappers, they were almost considered extinct in the state of California. There were a few that in the Bay Area and along rivers. Okay, along rivers, because they could hide in the banks. So, and this is where history, you need to look at history too. So when the first book came out on fur-bearing mammals, and they talked about beaver, they said, curiously, in our state at the present time, no beavers live in the high mountains, although here mountain streams and bordering growths of deciduous trees abound. Indeed, the golden beaver, so far as we know, never existed in an altitude higher than about 1,000 feet, and all the existing colonies live below 300 feet. Well, it's because he didn't go back and check anything. I mean, they were trapping beavers all over the place. Okay, the next one. This is Grinnell. He was a biologist. And this is a picture from his book of his map. I've got a next one, but this is basically what he outlined. To the north, the beavers, and then the central, and then the river beavers down here along the Colorado. Okay, next. So this is a little better picture. So you can see this was what in the 1937 they thought was the distribution of beavers. So anything above 1,000 feet, all that up into the high country, was not considered whatever. And again, now we're looking at synchronic versus diachronic. He was looking at one point in time, synchronic, but if you look diachronic over time, you're getting a different conclusion. Okay, the next. And the reason that the beavers survived down at the lower altitudes is because they didn't make beaver houses. They lived in the sides of the banks of those slow But if the rivers flow too fast, they can't, so there had to be certain conditions. And what happened was they couldn't find all of them, so they couldn't kill all of them down there. So they trapped them out in the higher country because all you do is find a beaver dam, yank out a few sticks, put in a trap, and you're in business. So it didn't take a lot of brain power to do that. But here you can see they rarely build dams in California, but live in burrows along the bank. So that's because they killed all of them up in the woods. Okay, now that was in 1863 when the guy said that, incidentally. So from a historical perspective, I went out and I tried to understand, well, again, history can give you some information. I looked in the Sierra Nevada place names, and John Warner did talk literally about them trapping beavers up the San Joaquin River, I believe it was. There's historical accounts of the Klamath River, Lower Russian region, and then the Laguna Santa Rosa I mentioned before, and Alameda Creek. So there's several places that I'm not sure why that one there, but it was Kit Carson. Kit Carson's account of trapping on Alameda Creek is the bottom one. So what would affect the beavers up there? Well, one thing was grazing. There were so many sheep up there, it's hard to actually quantitate it, but I'll show you in a second. But it doesn't take long to imagine what that many sheep could do to a mountain meadow. Okay, the next picture. It takes even less time to figure whether that many sheep can do the side of a hill. This is on the Mendocino Forest near Snow Mountain, about 1920. That's a band of sheep back then. There were usually Indian herders, and their wives often would come every 2 or 3 weeks up to where they were camped and drop off their food. A lot of these were 1 or 2 Indian men out. And the general size of a band of sheep there was about 2,000 animals, plus or minus. So this is about 2,000 animals, and I have information that shows me there were up to 100,000 sheep grazing up in the Yolla Bolly. So if you take 50 of those bands of sheep and run them across the country, that's a lot of impact to the next slide. And so this is what results. And so, it doesn't take much, again, to impact beavers because you're badly putting sedimentation into the rivers and all kinds of stuff. So the next one. So I thought, well, what else can I do to try to find out if there were beavers? I'll look at the ethnographic data. So I looked at George Foster's A Summary of Yuki Culture, because the Yuki were out of Round Valley. And I'm great with word search now. I went through and he only mentions beavers 3 times in an over 300-page book. And it's interesting because the first one, beavers and dogs were not killed. The next one was beavers were netted in the water, shot with a bow and were good eating. So you can take your pick, but they are mentioning beavers. And the last one, which I thought was important, was wealth was represented by a variety of utilitarian and non-utilitarian objects. A rich man owned hides of beaver, otter, milk, panther, bear, and occasionally elk. So that's all in this entire book, but it does give me an idea there could have been, it's at least suggested there may have been beavers up there, but again, it's go ahead, the next, it's not sure. And then place names, again, I found Beaver Creek and I found Beaver Glade up there, and they flow into the middle fork of the Eel River. Go ahead. And then, and this is just before I was getting ready to put this out, because obviously I still hadn't come to any conclusions. I went down to Upper Lake and gave a talk to the folks there. It's down by near Clear Lake there. Upper Lake is the ranger station for the Mendocino National Forest. And I got a call from a guy I know there, and he says, I talked with a geologist that has worked in many other areas, and when discussing the topography of the Yolla Bolly area, he stated that it sure looked like the area had been influenced by beaver ponding in the past. Indicators are gradients, changes in stream direction, and points along the channel where possible dams were located. So pretty strong evidence there. Okay, the next slide. So when I got to my conclusions, and this was in 2013, I still didn't know if there were beavers up there. I thought there was a good chance there had been beavers up there, but I thought I laid out the possibilities. It was suitable. I found it was suitable beaver habitat in the high peaks region with willow and alder, especially along with the aspen trees. And there were beavers trapped in lower Begum and Cottonwood Creek, which flow into the Central Valley. And beavers could travel up to 5 miles a day, so there's no reason they couldn't be up there. But my conclusion being, trying to be conservative on this, it is possible that beavers once inhabited the region based on environmental and geomorphological evidence, but became extinct prior to the historic era due to the loss of sufficient habitat, resulting in an inability to maintain a healthy, genetically diverse population. Okay, and it is possible. And then the other option was it is possible that an isolated remnant beaver population survived in the Yolla Bolly Mountains into the early 19th century from the Pleistocene, despite fluctuations and changes in climate. And that's where I left my paper there. Okay. One more thing then happened since then. Okay, the next slide. So this is the rest of the story again. And this is Nathaniel Barney, Henry Barney, and his family. And they moved into Clovelo in 1872. And I was friends with his great, God knows how many, but several grandson, Floyd Barney, who was an employee at the Clovelo Ranger District. And he was born in Halls Creek Valley on the North Fork of the Eel. So they homesteaded out there way early on. Okay, next. And I didn't even know this because I talked to him for years, but I'm only talking about the Yolla Bolly. So I never asked him about beavers because it just never came up in our conversations. So I opened his book, and he's since passed away just recently, but I opened his book, and this was in his book. Walter James, an old-time hunter and trapper in this locality, is said to have caught beaver along what is now known as Beaver Creek in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and there was a local belief that he did so. William and James Foster, uncles of Walter, who lives at Barney Meadows, said that during the 1870s, they found remains of beaver dams and stumps of beaver cut trees along the creek. And that's it. So now you get to decide. I think to me, it's, if you know the difference between beyond a reasonable doubt and preponderance of evidence, this is probably a preponderance of evidence, but it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think there's more evidence that there were beavers up there, possibly a few lasting into the 1860s or 1870s, and they're now extinct. But again, I always caution that that's what it looks like because we have no direct evidence. That's as close as we've got direct evidence. But I can tell you, having done this for a few years, people like Barney, they know what they're talking about. So anyway, that's the talk. Now I have another talk if you want, about 15 minutes if you want to get radical. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to get a little bit over the top. Currently, this is going to be contemporary. And if you want to put on that thing, I'll do some questions first.
I was going to just say, with 30 minutes left, I think a Q&A session would be great to wrap it up for tonight. Yeah. Unless, I'm sorry, was that a disappointed look over there? There's quite a few people on the chat in the Zoom room who would love to hear this talk. So are we okay with going into?
Or should we do Q&A first?
Maybe, yeah, let's do like 5 minutes of Q&A and then we can mosey to the next presentation. And please, snacks.
No, I haven't. Okay, yeah, and again, it's out of my area, so I'm not gonna, I was pretty focused on that. I'd never get done if I wrote too wide of a history, it's too much. So I'm trying to focus on the North Fork, because you'll start chasing rabbits if you don't, so.
North Fork of the Eel.
Eel River, yeah. And that well-defined area above Halls Creek that I had circled on the map.
Any other questions before we dive into the radical talk?
Yeah, this is the rad, so, but I'm gonna give this an Oregon, so we'll see how that goes.
Alrighty.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, y'all in the Zoom room, can you see the slideshow? Okay, great. And we're still good on audio, everyone?
Okay, there we are.
Okay.
I got into this by accident. Okay, this was an accident, but I was so mesmerized by her story that I stopped everything and spent 2 weeks looking at this story. And I call it Amelia Sussman, a woman of substance. And as most of you know, women used to be not paid much attention to. So she never even became an anthropologist. We're going to go through how all of this happened. Okay, the next slide. So and that just shows again that she's out there. This paper is out there. Okay. So she was born in 1915. She was the valedictorian of her graduating class, and after graduation, her biographer wrote, since she was just under 5 feet tall, she was ineligible to work at Macy's, the usual graduation option for women until marriage. So she was too short to even work at Macy's. So she enrolled in Brooklyn College, got an AB in psychology, and go ahead now. And then she heard that Franz Boas at Columbia University was accepting women, and not only that, is accepting Jewish. She had two things against her. She was Jewish and a woman. Okay, and back then it wasn't cool apparently to be either one. So she took the subway over to see Boas, and Boas who was Jewish himself. He was one of the few people that were putting women into the PhD programs. And if you know Margaret Mead, if that name's familiar, she was one of his students, and also Ruth Benedict. Okay, so the next one. And so he's basically viewed as the founder of anthropology. And he established the first anthropology department in the United States, and Kroeber was his first PhD student, okay? So I'll go through this a little fast so I can get people out. But this is at the time, the big theory out there, even among what few anthropologists, which like I say, it really didn't come into its own until the 1900s, but was the theory of scientific racism. And that is that there was a difference in intelligence between civilized people and the more primitive people, and it was based on brain size. So these people spent years measuring the brains of people, and they came up with this conclusion that the people with the biggest brains just happened to be white Europeans, and everybody else had a smaller brain. So obviously, you know, there's a problem with them. They're not going to be able to learn as fast. And the general consensus of anthropology at the time was the Indians were disappearing. That within a few years they were going to go off into the sunset. If you've ever seen Edward Curtis's book, the cover is Navajo Indians going into the dark, you know, their backs to you, like they're going into an unknown future. This, and again, so under that type of a philosophy, this is, Edward Curtis took both those pictures. Which picture do you think ended up in his book? So that's the thing. Everybody looked like this in his book. That's true. You know, like they're all on downers. You know, all. So anyway, and it was called salvage ethnography. Okay, so the next. So anyway, and at Columbia University, she enrolls, and at the time, Ruth Benedict was there, who was quite famous. I have that book on my own shelf at home. It's one of the best-selling books, along with Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. But being a woman, they brought in another guy. to take over the department. She didn't get the department she should have got. Okay, next slide. And who'd they bring in? But Ralph Linton. And Ralph Linton believed in acculturation, so he believed all Indians were going to disappear. So he was not happy with all this, and he did not like Ruth Benedict. In fact, according to one guy that worked at Yale, he even once jokingly boasted that he had killed Benedict using the Tanala magic charm. So obviously they didn't get along too good. Okay. So during the summer of '37, Sussman comes out to California. She's one of 8 PhD candidates. Whoops. And they send her up to Round Valley. And he was assigned by Linton to study and compare acculturation in 8 tribes. So she was one of 8, and 3 of them were women that were funded to go out and do these studies of acculturation. Next slide. And so she ends up in Round Valley, and it just so happens at the time, and if you studied the Yuki, you know this is a well-known guy, Foster. He was a student of Krober's. He was up there studying the Yuki the same summer she was up there. And he wrote this: when I was among the Yuki, a graduate student from Columbia University arrived to study the Indians as they lived in 1937. I was faintly amused and not a little disdainful at the thought of such a non-anthropological subject.
Terrible.
Okay, so next slide. Oh, this gets interesting. Stay tuned. So this is pictures that she took, and that's how I got into this. This wasn't published until 1977, so I'm thinking that it wouldn't have anything I was looking for until I realized she had stuff on Lucy Young, and that's when I realized she was there in 1937, and she's still alive in 2020. I mean, she died at 106 years old.
Wow.
So this is one hell of a woman, you know. And so this is a picture. Boaz wanted side profiles. He's back into the morphology, cranial morphology, so that's why there's the side one. And that's Lucy and her husband, Sam Young, and he was Wintu. Okay. And they actually lived up on Soldier Basin. You can turn it. Soldier Basin on the North Fork of the Eel until they got so old they finally moved around Valley. So I'm going to read these next few things, even though it takes a second, because this gets to the crux of things, and then you'll get to try to figure out what happened. One hears very negative comments about the few Catholics. In the club, the more prosperous women get together in a sort of caste system. The church creates a holier-than-thou feeling, and the Baptists especially heap hellfire and damnation on the heretics. Okay, the next one. I do not doubt in the least, but have no proof, that such a white economy as is here was established first by land-grabbing Indian owners and then by a great deal of free pasturage on Indian-owned range. Mm-hmm. Next one. There's a special resentment against outsiders. And I lived 10 miles from the Georgia border when I went to Florida State in 1974, and the doctor in Quincy had a separate waiting room for colored people. So this isn't that old. Okay, so there's special resentment against the outside. It sounded like here. Doctors, social workers, Indian service workers, anthropologists, and the few residents whose interests are not bounded by the foothills all find life in Covelo difficult. The feeling of the townspeople is that these people are betraying Covelo and white society. They are white people who go to the reservation to agitate the Indians.
Oh boy.
Okay, and the next one. Syphilis is politely called tuberculosis. However, the Indians have less venereal disease than the whites of the same economic class, according to the county nurse. Next one. Relief or welfare for the Indians is opposed by the whites. Even one of the more sympathetic white women said they do not feel that the county should be responsible for Indians since the government dumped them there. And this is the Yuki that have been there for 5,000 years.
God.
Yeah. Next one. On the social plane, there's no mingling. One of the quietest, best spoken, and cleanest of the Indian women has only been in 3 White Houses in her entire life as a servant. Next one. Boarding schools took away most of them from home during the years when they might have learned something of the old customs, and even recently, within the last 15 or 20 years, children were forcibly prevented from using Indian expressions or playing Indian games in day school. Next. So she goes back to Columbia, and you may guess this wasn't received real well, okay? Because it turns out Linton, who believes in acculturation, he hates this kind of stuff because she's only supposed to be going back and looking at how Indians used to be. So her research on these atrocities, it never got published. Next slide. He was in charge, and one of the reasons was, he said, this was his excuse, he was afraid that this guy who committed mail fraud by collecting $6 a year from each Indian and got $102,000 together, which is a hell of a lot of Indian money. And so when he was accused of fraud, he filed against the Commissioner of Bureau of Indian Affairs a $125 million lawsuit, which sounds like something some of these people would do today. That, you know, type thing. Well, at 125 million back then would be like a $2 billion lawsuit or something today. Okay, next slide. So when the book came out, it was acculturation in 7 tribes. One tribe got, and so basically she was essentially instructed by Linton to pursue a new dissertation subject, despite the fact that she had just completed a dissertation. Next slide. So she was not about the flautist of editorial authority. At the bottom, I think, captures it all. Genocide and exploitation of native peoples to the point of slavery were not, I suppose, popular subjects in 1937. Okay, next slide. So to be safe, this is her, she was given a second dissertation, which she completed, called The Accent on the Winnebago. Just to be safe, this is Sam Blostake standing in front of her house in New York City. They weren't going to let her go out to the country and go to another reservation and cause problems. So they brought the Indian to her. And so her dissertation was on the accent of the Winnebago. And then after she finished that second dissertation and finally got it signed out by Ruth Benedict, she joined the Army because World War II was coming up. And she finally got her PhD by spending her own money, $300, which was a fortune back then, especially for somebody that's in it. And she got 75 copies, which they accepted as a substitute for reprints, and she received her PhD. Okay, next slide. So the rest of the story, it appears from contemporary perspective, her controversial Round Valley study was career-ending. And despite having written 2 dissertations under no less than Franz Boas, Ralph Litton, and Ruth Benedict, she was never able to get a job in anthropology. She was blackballed. Next slide. Why? As head of the department, this guy was an FBI informant.
Oh my God.
See how interesting history can be? So he was informing against Boas and many of his students to the FBI, accusing them of being communists, and this led to some of them being fired and blacklisted. So again, what we're talking about is the politics. It's next slide. There he is, good old Senator Joe. So basically, and also her husband, Dutch Schultz, was, if you know Pete Seeger, he had politics like that with Guthrie. In other words, extremely left. They weren't exactly communists, but they were floating with socialism in that area. So he never gave her a positive reference. Okay, next slide. And I got a picture of Pete Seeger testifying between. He was actually found guilty, and in the Supreme Court found that he had his rights. And he said he would not testify under his right to free speech, which was different than the other people. So anyway, so Linton's strong dislike for Boas and his rejection of the notion, Boas's rejection of the notion of racial superiority was a reason enough to do this to Linton. You can go to the next slide. And this is the important thing, especially for people that are going to HSU. This was not a time that can be considered one of courage for the large academic institutions or many within the anthropological community who bent to the winds of political repression intended to avoid any potential problems by simply avoiding controversial issues that might cause someone to question their loyalty to their country, who might have caused them to be spreading socialist or communist propaganda. Next. And so she got a job. She eventually went back to school, got a master's degree, and started to work at the University of Washington. Okay, the next one. And that's when her book came out, and that's when it got my attention. And this is Heiser helped publish it to right a wrong, or perhaps a mistake. Well, it was a wrong. So that's why it didn't come out until 1976. This is her PhD dissertation, published 39 years later. And so after the war, I entered social work and was discovered. And the reason I put Leadbelly up there was it reminded me of a blues singer. You know, they're sitting down in Mississippi somewhere, and some folk guy comes in and discovers them because she'd basically forgotten all about this thing. But Heiser took her, go ahead to the next one. We're almost done with the next. So again, she assisted Woody Guthrie's family who died of Huntington, Korea, and she became national trustee of the regional board for Huntington's chorea disease. Next one. And she was promoted to research instruction, retired, and lived another 44 years and passed away April 22nd, 2021. The last student of Franz Boas to die. And that's it. Oh, the one last thing. So this is Krober. So there's Krober proudly standing when they're naming Krober Hall. They're taking his name down now. Berkeley must acknowledge that influential scholars such as Krober participated in the dehumanization of Native Americans. He wasn't the sole actor. His actions weren't malicious, but they were flawed. Unnaming the building acknowledges that there was harm done. So that's it. But I thought that's a good thing for today to think about, is especially universities that want to respond politically because it's a less path. I can't wait till I show that in Oregon.
All right. Thank you, everyone in the Zoom room, and everyone here today. Do you have any final words? That's it? Mic drop? We're going to go ahead and end the Zoom room, and we'll share the recording when it shows up on my
Did you know
cloud.
John Larson out there? Did you know that name, John Larson, in Orleans?
Oh, who?
John Larson?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It was